As we celebrate our 30th annual conference, we put together this video package of voices from the past. I'm very grateful that we have video from our first few conferences, and I'm glad to be able to share this with you. Of course, we don't have video of everyone we would have liked to have heard from, but this gives us an opportunity to hear a bit more from each of these presenters. The clips range from about 7 minutes to about 20 minutes, and they range from 1994 to 2000, although not in that order. The final clip is one that many people asked me about when they heard I was putting this package together, and again, I'm very grateful to have it and to be able to share it with you. I hope that you enjoy watching this as much as we enjoyed putting it together.
Pelagius had described human freedom as the capacity of a neutral agent to make choices unconstrained and uncoerced, to contemplate options without internal or external restraints. It's just sort of equipoised, you see, between good and evil, undetermined even by their own previous choices. Neutral selves can will what they will. And the evidence for freedom on this account is inconsistency. The evidence for freedom is unpredictability, arbitrariness, the ability to will one thing one moment and the contrary thing the next. Augustine and Luther and Calvin saw nothing to cherish or respect in such an account of freedom. In their view, there are no neutral selves, no indeterminate agents who face choices unformed by the past, and no choices which do not form the determinate features of our common life and of ourselves. The Reformers appreciated the significance of the determinate features of our common life as much as they appreciated the importance of freedom. Particular human beings and their choices are formed by their natural endowments, by their communities, by their culture, by their past choices, by the choices of others with respect to them. And these features of human existence do limit human freedom, but it's precisely these features of human existence which also enable human freedom. There is no human freedom which does not marshal those endowments and weigh the claims of particular communities and interpret the culture and assess past choices and respond to actions upon us. People do all that, of course, not from some disinterested point in transcendence over all of that, but engaged in that, engaged with that, engaged with the determinate features of their existence. And the exercise of freedom determines not just one little discrete action cut off from the past or the future. It determines a whole self. The evidence of freedom on this model is not arbitrariness, but precisely consistency and predictability. And the point I want to make is this, that our choices, even the presumably innocent choice to maximize freedom, will express and form determinate features of our life and of our common life. In the name of freedom, we may ironically increase our bondage. The point can be illustrated with respect to technology. Technology is frequently introduced as a way to increase our options, to maximize our freedom. But it can quickly become socially enforced. It can become part of the determinate features of our existence. The car was introduced as an option to the horse, but you wouldn't want to ride a horse home on the interstate. The technology that surrounds our dying was introduced to give doctors and patients options in the face of disease and death. But such options have become socially enforced. At least you sometimes hear, we have no choice. Moreover, even if a particular option does not become socially enforced, simply providing the option can shape the determinate features of our life and of our common life. Our choice even to regard certain things as choices forms selves and society. If we begin to regard assisted suicide as an option, we may increase options, but we may also effectively eliminate an option, namely staying alive without having to justify one's existence. Now that happens to be an option that I would like to protect and preserve, for it fits the story of life as a gift. And there is this point, that the very giving of a choice can create some pressure to make a particular choice. The point's not a subtle one. I think it gets lost only when we overestimate our autonomy and independence. Our sense of self is always confused with our interpretation of what others think of us. The suicide threat, after all, is at least sometimes a call for help. And to reply to such an inquiry by giving an option can all too easily be read as an answer to that inquiry about whether anybody really cares. It can affect the resources that a person has for choosing still to live. And if that's true in individual cases, it's also true culturally. Providing the choice of assisted suicide to the vulnerable, to the dependent, to those who are no longer in control is recommended, doubtlessly, and genuinely, as a way to increase their options, to enable them to assert their independence and to take control. It expresses a culture and it forms attitudes that value autonomy and independence and control. The effect of maximizing freedom in this way may be to make it more difficult for the sick and the suffering, more difficult for the dependent, more difficult for those who seem not to be in control, more difficult for all of them to refuse the option of death, harder to justify their existence. The social innovation in the name of increasing options not only eliminates the option of receiving life as a given, it also shapes the way the options will be perceived when life is a choice. Now, our culture may be obsessed with individual autonomy, with control. And it would express and reinforce that feature of our common life by offering dependent people a choice, offering them an option which extends self-control. But the reason that we have for giving the option may well make it more difficult for people not to throw in the towel. If we choose to give this option, we're choosing not just a discrete piece of social policy, but a pattern for our life together which asks the weak and the sick to justify their existence. But to refuse freely to give that option is to choose for ourselves a pattern of life where life is received as a gift, even when it cannot be cherished as a gift, and where being dependent on others and on God is accepted as our common situation. And then we would have returned to a freedom somewhat closer to Luther's sense. And I thank you all very much.
So I think we're at a critical point in the societal-wide debate. With diminished confidence in our ability to enact major restrictions on abortion through the political process, Christians have an opportunity to address the issue at a deeper level, to attempt to reshape societal consensus, to do more complex analysis, and maybe offer some new insights. One way to do this is by listening to the women's stories, listening to their accounts of their decisions, asking what we can learn, what these stories tell us about institutions of family and workplace, of law and church, what they tell us about virtue and responsibility, what these stories suggest in terms of implications for Christian response. I'd like to suggest 5 implications for Christian ethical reflection and practice. First, in the abortion debate, we should avoid language that silences the deep ambivalence and regret that characterize actual abortion decisions. The abortion accounts remind us that countless people in our society are living with moral tragedy. They need help in confronting their choices, in acknowledging their responsibility, in coming to repentance, and in finding forgiveness and healing. There is an enormous need and opportunity for pastoral care. Women who have had abortions may be some of the best advocates for life, but their voices need to be heard as they find a way to acknowledge their actions and their guilt and their grief. Second, we need to recognize the compelling power of appeals to control, choice, and autonomy. In their raw form, these values stand against the deepest Christian concerns about dependence on God and interdependence in community. The emphasis on control, particularly when it's related to life and death issues, denies that life is a gift and trust from God. But in these accounts, we also see how potent these values are, especially to those who have had little control and influence, even over their own lives. The complicated oppression of women has made abortion appear to be a tool of freedom. We need to challenge appeals to autonomous individual control as borrowing from the language and history of domination. Christians can challenge the pro-woman, pro-abortion configuration by offering genuine support to women, by helping women experience equality and respect, and by valuing women's life plans. Third, we need to help women talk about dealing with unexpected pregnancies. The emphasis on privacy, even secrecy, has allowed and sometimes pressed women to make the decisions alone. But difficult decisions should not be made alone, outside of a moral community. We can have some confidence that careful reflection and honest accounts from other women who have had abortions will help women with problem pregnancies make choices that favor life. Support groups in the past helped women feel that abortion was an expression of control and gave them the rhetoric to describe it that way. Support groups today could also help women to choose against abortion. Abortion is a major decision, a decision that is often regretted but cannot be undone. Therefore, efforts to require parental consent for minors, informed consent for all women, efforts to make sure women know about other options and have faced the implications and consequences of abortion are significant public policy restrictions that would help to limit the impact of legalized abortion. Fourth, we need to recognize that abortion does seem like the easier choice to many people. The accounts suggest that being pro-life will involve much more than being anti-abortion. It requires thoughtful attention to the context of abortion decisions, to the structural arrangements, and to relationships that leave abortion looking like the easiest and most responsible choice. Many women report that they would have been very willing to keep the child under better circumstances, which I think suggests that positive efforts to improve the circumstances of women faced with unexpected pregnancies could have a significant impact on the abortion rate. In fact, we have a public policy on abortion that is not connected to laws or decisions about abortion, but is connected to the reasons that killing unborn children can seem like a reasonable, responsible choice in our society. Policies in the absence of them on health care, family, maternity and paternity leaves, mother-child nutrition are deeply connected to whether or not abortion will be rare. As a society, we have almost unlimited liberty regarding abortion and remarkably limited support for children, families, and women who carry pregnancies to term. Until our laws and institutions are supportive of the well-being of women, children, and families, it is unlikely that abortion will become rare. But today we need to be increasingly careful that the policies we advocate will encourage personal responsibility without simultaneously encouraging abortion. Laws that allow abortion on demand are highly problematic. Law has a pedagogical function, and the legal alternative of abortion when faced with problem pregnancies makes birth seem irresponsible. In addition, allowing private decision and personal choice to control the life prospects of another has left our society very morally confused. For most women, the decision to abort was highly ambivalent. David Reardon suggests that any slight change in circumstances or encouragement from significant persons in their lives, especially husbands and boyfriends, could have brought about a reversal of their choice. This suggests to me that Christians can take the lead in recognizing the importance of male responsibility and support. And fifth, we need to help shape and model Christian understandings of responsibility. Abortion accounts suggest that the actual decisions are framed less by normative principles than by the condition of relationships, situational variables, and expected consequences. Responsibility is much more than making a choice and accepting the consequences. Responsibility requires a constant conversation between oneself and one's moral community and God. Adherence to God's laws and reflection of God's character are responses to being in covenant relation with God. Thus, the commandment against killing and the requirement to choose life are fundamental dimensions of responsibility. But this responsibility must both be taught and modeled for it to effectively challenge the truncated notions of responsibility as control and choice. Christians and churches could be much more intentional about shaping a moral consensus that values the life of the fetus, that recognizes the danger of killing innocent life, that understands the importance of marriage and child rearing and nurture, and that values women's lives and life's plans. Perhaps, now that the legality of abortion is less threatened, people will be able to risk acknowledging how terrible it is and face the moral, emotional, physical, and spiritual damage that it does. The Christian community must model a hospitable welcome to the most vulnerable human beings, even if we cannot require that welcome throughout society. As we show that suffering and sacrifice have meaning, as we welcome unexpected strangers into our lives, as we provide communities of love and support that sustain women and families through difficult pregnancies and through difficult child rearing, we offer a vision of a community in which the most vulnerable have a safe place. And because of that, all of us have a deeper understanding of God's sacrificial welcome to us.
Now, this is a dangerous slide. I have been known to spend as long as an hour and a half on this one slide. And how long do I, let's see, we finish at 9:30. Okay, 5 minutes max on this one slide. And this is the method that I use in analyzing a problem. And the idea is that when we're confronted with an ethical dilemma, there are at least 4 sets of factors that we need to think about. There are the medical indications in the upper left-hand quadrant, the patient preferences in the right upper quadrant, quality of life in the left lower, and contextual features in the right lower. And I set them up in this quadratic fashion for a very specific reason. Because 90, 95, maybe more % of the time, we can resolve the issue staying above the line. We can look at the medical indications and the patient preferences and come to a conclusion. But sometimes we have such a poor prognosis and no idea what the patient wants, but we still have to make a decision. That's when we drop below the line and look at the secondary issues of quality of life and context. Now, the words quality of life give many people shivers, thinking that it's either sanctity of life or quality of life. Well, I'm here to tell you, quality of life is not a dirty word. Everybody has a quality of life. My quality of life is pretty decent this week. Last week I had a backache. It wasn't quite so good. Quality of life varies from day to day. But the most important thing is that quality of life is very personal and very subjective. And it is multidimensional. And physicians and nurses and people in medical practice are very poor judges of patients' quality of life. There have been 5 or 6 studies now that have shown that if you ask patients about their quality of life and you rate them on a quality of life scale, and there are 100 different scales you can use, but you ask them and you get a number, and then you ask the caregivers about the patient's quality of life, whether it's home caregivers, family caregivers, or professional caregivers. Always, 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 the patients say their quality of life is higher than their caregivers say. Patients will put up with a lot. I learned that this is the one story, maybe this is the one story I'm going to tell about on this thing. I learned a lot about quality of life from a young man, 33 years old, who until age 22 was perfectly healthy. Professional musician, loved to play football, very active and so on. And then he got sick and overnight was transformed into a ventilator-dependent quadriplegic. He got a viral infection of his spinal cord up in the neck, and he was unable to breathe on his own, unable to move anything below his chin. For 11 years he had been like that. He'd gone through rehab, he'd been cared for at home by his family, and had done quite well for 9 years, but in the 2 years before I was asked to do a consult on him, he had had repeated respiratory infections. One pneumonia after another, each one requiring a little longer hospitalization, each one requiring a little stronger antibiotics, each one with more resistant bugs, and each one leaving him with more residual secretions. And he had talked with his pulmonary specialist, and he recognized that he was dying a pulmonary death, slowly. He was in the hospital again with another infection, under treatment, and was actually getting better. And he said to the young resident taking care of him, "You know, I think it's time to stop the ventilator so that I can die." And she came to me and said, "He wants us to help him commit suicide, and we can't do that, can we?" And, I mean, that's a whole discussion that we could have for some time. I'm not going to focus on that. What I want to tell you is what I learned from this young man. When I went to talk to him, I said to myself, I talked with his home care nurse and his hospital nurse and his brother and his mother and his best friend, and I got a picture of him, and then I went to talk with him spent a long time with him. And I said to myself, this poor bugger, 11 years lying on his back, hooked up to a machine. What a poor quality of life, I says to myself. Didn't say that to him, obviously. What I said was, "Tell me, what's it been like for 11 years? And the first words out of his mouth were, "It's not been so bad being a quad." I said, "Tell me more." He said, "Well, my family loves me, and they take care of me. I have friends. I had friends before I got sick. They're still my friends. They come, and I have a portable ventilator in a van. They take me out in the van, go out to the shooting range. I watch them shoot targets. I watch them square dance. I have a voice-activated computer. I can turn on my CD player. I can make phone calls. It's not been so bad." I was looking at his physical dimension and said, poor quality of life. He was telling me that his psychological, social, cognitive, spiritual dimensions were okay. Quality of life is a very personal and subjective item. When I was younger and smarter, I used to think that things were pretty black and white. Things in medicine, things in life in general. But the older I've gotten and the more gray hair I've gotten, the more gray I see between that black and white. And some of that gray is because some things are ethically neutral. They are neither right nor wrong. But some of the gray is because of confusion. Some of the gray is because of ignorance. And part of my job as a clinical ethicist is to help families and physicians and healthcare team cope with the ethically neutral and the uncertainty, And part of it is to help them sort out the confusion and the ignorance and move those areas into black or white when that's appropriate. Now, the method of case analysis, which I should say, by the way, is not the only way to analyze cases. There are lots of ways. David Thomasma has an ethics workup that he does that's quite workable. The one that I showed you is just the one that I happen to use and be comfortable with. But it's a very casuistic approach. And I think physicians fall into casuistry very easily because physicians look at cases. What are we going to do? This case is a little bit different from this one, and how do we decide, and so on. And when I first became acquainted with casuistry, I thought it was situation ethics and relativism, and it made me nervous. But the more I've learned about it, the more comfortable I feel. It's a way of working through things and deciding which theological, ethical, medical principles apply in this case and why there's prioritization in this case differently from another case. That works. It's practical. However, it's not enough. Ed Pellegrino, in a beautiful essay in JAMA last year, I think the title of the essay was Compassion is Not Enough, said casuistry is a useful method of case analysis, rooted in legal procedure, but it's a dubious way to establish a moral norm. The problem with relying solely on the casuistic method of paradigm cases is that there must be something beyond the case by which to judge the case. And I think this is particularly pertinent for Christian physicians. And I'm really nervous showing these next few slides with all you philosophers and theologians out there, so I'm going to whip right through them and hope that there aren't too many questions. But I just want to point out that there are different levels of thinking in ethics. I spend most of my time down at the bottom here. Ethical decisions. What are we going to do for this particular patient? And we help decide that by looking at the ethical rules. And the ethical rules can change. The ethical rules include state laws and professional oaths and so on. In the Oath of Hippocrates, which I think very highly of, the physicians swear not to operate for kidney stones. Not because there's anything inherently wrong with operating for kidney stones, but back in those days, if you left a kidney stone alone, there was a possibility it might pass. And if you operated, the patient was almost surely going to die. So there was reason behind it. Anyway, the rules can change. Brain death, concept of brain death is a new rule. Where do we get the rules? Well, the rules come from ethical principles, and there are fewer than one might think. And those principles are based on the person's ethical system or method of moral reasoning, and that is determined by their worldview. Now, the reason that I'm going in this direction is I'd like to point out that there is a difference. I mean, you all know this, but there is a major difference between the way that Christians or theologically oriented people look at these things than the secularist does. And I'd like to try to flesh out this outline with the two different perspectives. On the left is the secular anthropocentric worldview, which says that man is autonomous, that reason, human reason, is the way to go, and is looking for universal principles. The Christian, the person coming from a God-centered universe, says that God is sovereign, and that there is revelation from God on how we should act, and we look to biblical principles. This is the slide that really scares me. So, the methods of moral reasoning. The secularist looks at teleological methods or deontological methods, or may use casuistry. And the Christian, too, primarily looks at deontological methods, biblical, in quite a variety of different schools. Legalism, antinomianism, situationism, and casuistry as well. Then the principles. This is the one that I've spent a little more time on and want to continue to work on. I would appreciate your feedback on it. On the left side, the secularist has what's been called the Georgetown mantra of beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, and justice. And the Christian subscribes to most of those as well. But we work with compassion and the sanctity of life principle. We're concerned about truth-telling and chastity. And one that we don't like to talk about, don't like to think about, there may be some value in suffering. Now, you hardly ever find a secularist that will admit that or subscribe to that. And many Christians are very uncomfortable accepting that. But I think that there is teaching about that in Scripture. In relation to autonomy, which is so prevalent and has been so dominant in the secular ethics field for so many years, Christians too believe in free will and dominion over oneself and over the earth and so on. But the next step is going beyond to stewardship of our resources and ourselves under a sovereign God. It's really a different worldview than just the autonomous individual. We too believe in justice. Justice, as you know, is getting what you deserve. But we also believe in mercy. That's not getting what you deserve. And we believe in grace. That's getting what we don't deserve. And all this is couched in a context of eternal hope. So I think there is a difference in the way we look at these things. The Bible speaks to ethical principles when Micah says, God has shown you, O man, what is good. That's ethics, right? Looking for what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice? There's one. And to love mercy. There's two. And to walk autonomously. Oh no, that's not what it says. And to walk humbly with thy God. The rules, I must move on. We have, in the secular worldview, we have state laws, case law, codes of ethics, institutional policies, aphorisms, and so on. And the Christian, too, subscribes and respects these as well, but has in addition the Old Testament law, the life of Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount, epistles, and so on. And making specific decisions. The secularist talks with the patient first, includes the family. When there is conflict, may involve the ethics committee, and when there's unresolvable conflict, may go to court. And the Christian has these same options. We talk with the family, the patient, include the family. But we also have a moral community. And I think we sometimes don't rely sufficiently on the moral community and involve the individual's pastor and church community. And we have the Holy Spirit, and I put that up with a little bit of reservation because I don't want people to think I'm being flip about this, but I really do think that we have a spirit that we can look to for guidance in specific cases. So what we are left with as Christians in the medical ethics realm is, I was going to say a juggling act, and that too sounds flip, but we are really trying to balance the sovereignty of God, the stewardship of the physician, and the autonomy of the patient. All true, real entities with which we cope on a day-to-day basis. We've talked a fair amount about technology. Technology has introduced problems, but technology is not the problem. The problem is uncertainty. And we deal with this all the time. And we don't have black and white ways to deal with uncertainty. We are right in the middle of the gray. Dealing with uncertainty, we can use human reason, we can use tradition, medical tradition, and so on, or we can also use meditation and revelation to try to help us deal with uncertainty. Until he has said, do we not have to accept the fact that under the shadow of forgiveness, different decisions are possible and different liberties and loyalties exist? That gives me a sense of reassurance as I deal with patients and uncertainties and some of the gray areas in medicine. Thank you.
Thank you and good evening. What a joy it is to see such a tremendous response to this conference. When my colleague Nancy Pearcey and I were first talking about this a year ago, when Trinity invited us to come, the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity invited us to come and participate in this conference, we kind of wondered how many people would respond to an invitation for a conference on bioethics. And wherever I go, people say to me, bioethics, what is that? And so it was a thrill to learn of the great response to this conference and to see all of you here this evening. Don't pay any attention. I have trouble with recording devices and microphones. It seems to follow me around. The issue of life, the quality of life, Paul Johnson, the great British historian, says that the great issue of the 20th century was totalitarianism, and the great issue of the 21st century will be life. Abortion only opened the gates. Next will be the kinds of things that will be discussed here over the next few days: cloning, eugenics, controlling life. And then eventually euthanasia, not so far down the road as a matter of fact. Critical that we understand the pressures that are going to be on us as a society, quickly upon us. Just think what a tempting prospect it is, that we might really be able to improve the species. Think about it. I mean, the utopians have always wanted to create the perfect world, the brave new world. In the 60s, the utopians believed we could do it with social engineering through politics. It failed. Everybody now, from President Clinton right across the political spectrum, is saying big government has failed in its effort to bail out the ghettos and to help the poor. Social engineering of the utopians of the 60s failed. Now, we can really be utopians in the Petri dish. We can create the perfect person, the perfect race. Of course, there's a small downside, as Nobel Prize winners Francis Crick and James Watson said, who proposed that we examine the newborn to see who is fit to live, because if we're going to create the perfect race, then of course we have to weed out the unfit. What a temptation. But there's an enormous dilemma here for Christians. We aren't Luddites. We aren't trying to stop progress. Genetic research may lead to some very, very important medical advances, and you've already heard examples of that this evening. The critical question that we have to be the only ones in our society who can do this, the critical answers that we have to provide are, what are the restraints? Technology says you can do it, but ought you to do it? Is it something you should do? And we're the ones who bring that dimension to bear. Can you imagine what it would have been like if there were no moral restraints on the use of the atom bomb? No, you can't imagine what it would be like, because none of us would be here. Atom bomb would have destroyed the world with no moral restraints. And the same may be said for any kind of technology. I've read the work of the Warnock Committee in London, England, and when Dame Mary Warnock concluded there is no such thing as a moral expert, so everyone has a right to judge for himself. That is, to sort out what our feelings are and to justify them. That's one thing human beings are very good at doing. That's the extent of the ethical reflection. No, if it doesn't come from us, where will it come from? The issue is not what we can do. The issue is what we ought to do. The issue is ethics. Who's going to decide matters of life and death? Who's going to decide what is legitimate genetic engineering and what is eugenics? Who's going to decide how far you can go in creating a superior species? What an awesome responsibility falls on the Church of Jesus Christ. Lonely battle that we will fight as we begin to say to this society, yes, you can do these things, but you shouldn't do them. As I bring this to a close tonight, I've posed to you what I consider to be the environment in which you're going to have to wrestle with ethical questions affecting medical, biological technology, genetic engineering. The ethics half of the bioethics. And you'll hear some startling things over the next couple of days on the biological half. But the more startling they are, and we're not against progress, but the more startling they are, the more fearsome they can become if we don't figure out how to develop those moral restraints. But two things the church must do. Two things those of us in this room must do. One is to develop a well-reasoned Christian apologetic in the issue of medical and biological ethics. We've got to be prepared when the Apostle Peter said, be prepared to give a reason for the hope which is within you, with gentleness and reverence. He's talking about being able to explain the truth of Christian revelation, not just to be able to give the four spiritual laws, but be able to say why God cares for all of his creation. What is the reason for the hope which is within us? We've got to be prepared to defend a Christian view of ethics in a world which has disdained it and which raises the Trump always says who. We've got to be able to say, we'll tell you who said it. Not only God, but the moral order of the universe and the absolutes that all civilized societies have lived by. And second, it's absolutely critical that we be the church. I don't think there's ever been a time, in modern times at least, when it has been more urgent for the people of God simply to be the people of God. What is our primary witness to the world? By this, the world will know that you are my disciples. Your love for one another. That's how the quality of the Christian life is being measured today, by our love for one another. Are we a loving community? Do we radiate that love of Christ? Do people see something in us that they so desperately yearn for but can't articulate? It's deep in every human heart. But do they see us running around having our great theological battles in public, or do they see us snidely berating one another, or do they see us genuinely as a community of loving believers? The world will measure us, not so much by what we do, but by what we are and who we are. We serve a great God. He calls us only to be faithful and a loving community and to defend what we know to be truth. And He's sovereign and will do the rest. God bless you. Have a wonderful conference.
We need to have answers, and they're scripturally, spiritually valid answers, so that we can stand on a foundation without apology to an Almighty God and say, God, I want to hold your hand and walk in the future.
To be a healer requires a willingness, an assumption, if you will, on the public's part, but a willingness on our part to be ethical in every single dimension of our practice, of our service.
Goodness is a generational phenomenon. Remember what God said to the Jews? If you keep this law, it will go well with you and your children.
From my own perspective, as somebody whose faith is very important to him, I have worried that we have not engaged the religious community in some of the serious ethical issues that are posed by the advances in this field, at least not to the degree that we need to.
What then is the vision of the body that comes to us from our faith in the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead? Like us, Jesus was truly a human being, born of a human mother. From Mary's womb he emerged a man, fully human, like us in all things but sin, and with a clearly physical body, subject to all the limitations that are the consequence of sin, although sinless himself. From the garden tomb, he also emerged a man, the same man born of the womb of the Virgin Mary, but no longer entirely like us in his body, for having passed through a fully human life and the ultimate barrier, limitation, death itself, he emerged transformed, possessing what St. Paul calls a spiritual body, and yet truly his, transformed, however, in ways that Scripture does not detail. But if, according to Christian faith, to return to our perspective, Jesus is the firstborn of the dead, not a freak of nature, but one who goes ahead of us, then it is the history of his body that tells us the meaning and the nature and the destiny of ours. The body is integral to salvation history because Jesus, our Savior, has risen from the dead with his own body transformed. An origin in time, therefore, does not demand that salvation mean an escape into eternity, neglecting the body as simply a prison. The bridge between psyche and spirit is that transformation that evangelists and doctrinal theologians call resurrection from the dead. Just as natural life is a gift, so is risen life pure gift. But between the one and the other comes the crucifixion of the body, Jesus' act of total self-sacrifice made possible by his material, human, physical body. In the light of faith, the gift of life must be surrendered, willingly sacrificed, so that the gift of eternal life can be received. It is in the face of this paradox, involving the incontestable superiority of the risen and unconstrained body, that the value of a distinctively Christian bioethical vision becomes apparent. In sketching the outlines of such a vision, however, a few words about the basic relationship between faith and reason are in order, for both are necessary for the development of ethical principles, including ethical principles in biology. What is the relationship, then, between Christian revelation and the faith that it elicits, and philosophy and science, which can be done without explicit dependence upon any faith? And what is that relationship, and how is it developed in such a way that we can develop moral principles that can bridge
the gap between believers and non-believers and direct a kind of a common enterprise according to ethical imperatives. As many of you know, John Paul has recently offered a long reflection on the relationship between faith and philosophy in an encyclical called Fides et Ratio. The Pope insists upon the need for purely philosophical methods and conclusions. There's an independent order of science and of human reason, capable of both interpreting the data of revelation and making it more intelligible and thus more credible before the act of faith itself. For faith is pure gift, but faith in St. Paul has a double dimension. Faith means trust, and faith means truth. To see the truths of faith, to see the world with the eyes of faith, is a gift from the God we believe in. But this same God also gives us the gift of human reason. And reason can explore the vision of faith on its own terms in theology, but also in philosophy and apologetics. Reason can prepare a thinker to receive the gift of faith without ever explaining the mysteries of faith themselves. Theology and faith, therefore, need philosophy and human reason. The Pope is clearly opposed to a fideism understood as an irrational faith, because that would put us in opposition to ourselves and, in a sense, in opposition to God, who creates us as believers and as thinkers. On the other hand, he also insists, the Pope does, that reason and philosophy and science as well have need of theology and other normative disciplines. He's opposed as well not only to fideism but to a rationalism, which would say that there is no connection between faith and reason, between theology and science. A rationalism that would limit rationality to what human reason can know on its own. Through the people of Israel and their history, through Jesus Christ and the body he left behind, God has revealed truths that both purify reason and compensate for its limitations. Grace, in other words, does not destroy nature, it perfects it. The relationship between faith and modern science, a relationship with a rocky past, continues to be problematic. Not so much in the fields of cosmology, where the difficulty started, but now much more in biology. Scientific truths, such as the replacement of an Aristotelian physics of rest with a Newtonian model, heliocentrism, microevolutionary development, cannot contradict the truths of the faith and may actually assist us in interpreting the meaning of revelation. Science, on the other hand, cannot operate completely independent of the kinds of normative considerations that come from a faith, whether supernaturally revealed or not, rather than from science itself. Underlying the scientific method are concepts that themselves transcend the empirical, as we all know, such as the existence of a law-governed material world intelligible to human reason. It's taken for granted. It's a presupposition not proven by scientific method itself. In this context, the modern scientific project is properly seen as grounded in a number of beliefs. Also, and perhaps more importantly, science as a purely descriptive enterprise cannot provide an account of the human good, and therefore cannot provide answers about which effects we should cause and which means to them are licit. Such normative considerations are the domain of both philosophy, human reason, specifically a metaphysics of the person and ethics, and also of theology, a discipline of faith, which, as indicated, should guide in some sense, at least in a regulative sense, philosophical reasoning. Unfortunately, however, the culture in which we live, in granting epistemological hegemony to the scientific method, has not only contradicted science's theologically supported foundations, but has also rendered meaningless any universally valid normative claims about such issues as the value of persons and what constitutes authentic human fulfillment. Even in our own arguments around this, we appeal to individuals being helped or being hindered. We appeal to groups. We appeal to a constitutional order that must respect everyone. We don't appeal to universally valid normative considerations, even when they're not derived from the faith itself, simply because the climate doesn't bear that kind of argument.
I'm afraid I don't have the advantage of a background in drama or histrionics. But what I'll try to do is give you 10 reasons that I think have some rationality behind them for deciding that the legalization, and that's the point I'm going to concentrate on, legalization, that's the question before us, of assisted suicide is something we should reject resoundingly. There is no sound moral, legal, or social reason for such legalization. I hope to show that the arguments in favor are specious, the benefits illusory, and the social consequences disastrous. Before I give you those 10 reasons, and I'm going to give them in order, I'd like to point out that since this program is under the auspices of a Christian organization, that I do accept that the strongest argument against assisted suicide and euthanasia is the argument based in the Christian, the Hebraic, and the Muslim traditions, which hold that human life is a gift of God and over which we are not absolute masters. In my rebuttal, I shall respond to some of Mr. Feiger's allegations about those who hold that particular point of view. But let me give my 10 reasons for your consideration. First, assisted suicide is not a protected constitutional right in American jurisprudence. So all the talk about right at least has no substance in American law. There is no basis for the limitation of the state's constitutional powers to forbid aid in suicide. The precedent in Supreme Court decisions and the common law is that assisted suicide is not a constitutionally protected liberty interest. Constitutional and common law confer the right to be free of unwanted bodily contact or invasion of bodily integrity. But the right to refuse treatment has never included a right to assistance in suicide. Moreover, the legal distinction, and that's what we're talking about, law, between holding, withdrawing unwanted treatment and an affirmative act causing death is unequivocal. The number of cases I'll be happy to cite in the rebuttal if it's questioned. To give constitutional status to assisted suicide is, in the recent words of the 9th District Court, quote, to invent a constitutional right unknown in the past that is antithetical to the defense of human life that has been a chief responsibility of constitutional government, close quote. So first, no legal basis for a right. Second, if assisted suicide were made legal or the Constitution were changed, it would still be morally wrong. Morality is not established by legislation, judicial decision, or referendum. Racial segregation, slavery, child labor, suppression of women's rights were all once legal, but never morally justified. For a law to be a good law, it must be based in good ethics. Assisted suicide is morally untenable, so any law that sanctions it is a bad law. Third, I speak now as a clinician of 50 years' experience, and I'm glad Mr. Feiger pointed out that I'm not just one of those ethicists, but a physician who has been involved in daily decision-making involving ethical issues. And I assure you, every single important clinical issue involves a moral question, not a question of simple choice. Assisted suicide is not necessary. With the optimal use of current methods of pain management and proper psychosocial and spiritual support, I must tell you as a physician again, the major challenge of a person dying of the kind that Mr. Feiger has been describing is a spiritual challenge. The accommodation with the sense of their own finitude and the inevitable confrontation with whether or not there is a God who requires something other than we want out of our free choice. Patients treated properly with a comprehensive approach do not ask that death be hastened. They can even control their own medication. All physicians do not practice proper pain control. I know that, and that is an indictment of the profession about which I'm unequivocal. But that all patients do not practice it does not constitute an argument for legalization. Legalization will discourage research in pain relief and impede physicians' education and attempts for comprehensive palliative care. Suicide is the easy way out of a difficult case for the physician and for those around the patient. To take a few tragic cases, and I would examine those with great care as a clinician, is to commit the fallacy of composition, to attribute as typical to the whole group the peculiarities of a single number of cases. Assisted suicide is not needed to prevent overtreatment. Prolonged dying connected to tubes and wires, the thing we hear about so much, is preventable by establishing a living will or a durable power of attorney. Patients can exercise the moral and legal right to refuse to discontinue treatment even when the capacity to make decisions is lost. The problem today is more often, I can assure you, in the clinical situation now, undertreatment rather than overtreatment. Judgments of the quality of life of other human beings made by those of us who are not experiencing the predicament of those human beings. And again, because physicians overtreat, is no logical excuse to terminate life. Fourth, suicide is not an autonomous choice. Patients with terminal illness are vulnerable to any suggestion that they are a burden to others. They already feel abandoned, alienated from healthy people, guilty for imposing on them, ashamed at their appearance and their weakness, and very sensitive to any suggestion that their lives are not worth living. If suicide is a legal option, the pressure to conform, to do the noble thing, the duty, would be extremely great. Nothing makes this more obvious than watching the Dutch television program. That wonderful program which was to convince us how free and autonomous the action was. Those of you who saw it, Mr. Cees van der Rek de Jude, a patient with a degenerative nervous disease. Look at that carefully, I assure you. See who was making the decision. Who did all the talking? The physician, the wife, their impetuosity, their impatience, their urging. That poor man said very little about himself. Once you start that process in which you think you're in control, you've begun to lose control. Fifth, autonomy and self-determination that end in giving the physician the power to administer death, those are illusory. It is the physician, not the patient, who determines when treatment is hopeless, suffering is unbearable, and the patient is ready for suicide. Legalized assisted suicide grants physicians an enormous increment of power over that which they already possess. To argue that subtle or overt abuses of that power can be prevented by legislative safeguards is totally unrealistic. In the end, physicians will be the ones to interpret whatever criteria are established. Physicians, like other human beings, cannot escape their personal prejudices, their values, their notions of what is a worthwhile life, how much suffering they would undertake. But that's not the question. Moreover, studies show repeatedly the majority of suicides come from patients who have serious psychiatric depression. Terminally ill patients treated for depression often change their minds about wanting to end their lives. How much autonomy? Who's in control? Look at the data. Sixth, assisted suicide is not a truly compassionate act. For one thing, compassion is an emotion. It's a feeling of co-suffering. That's what the word means from the Latin, compatio, to suffer with. As an emotion, it's commendable, but not in itself a moral justification for any particular action. Compassion must be subject to reason too. Too many injustices, and you know them, have been perpetrated in this world by compassionate people doing good for other people and deciding what was good for them. Compassion also does not mean acceding to anything a suffering person requests, particularly if that request is death. True compassion requires asking why a person is so desperate as to ask for death, not to start them down the pathway of death. It means sharing the predicament of the sufferer, of the other human being, understanding the unique reasons, and helping that person confront and ameliorate the causes of suffering. And as an internist, I can tell you that this is a process of diagnosis like any other. Suffering and pain are two separable entities. Suffering is the response to pain. It's highly individualistic, and it's based in many, many other factors than the physiological response to a noxious stimulus, which is what pain is. True compassion is compassion for the sufferer, not compassion displaced for the caregiver or the family, one time from time to time. To whom is the compassion being shown? As a physician, I admit to being frustrated, to feeling powerless. I admit to the fact that very often if the patient would die, it would relieve me of a responsibility. How do I separate that urge, that grieving of my own compassion for myself when I'm approaching the patient and I have in my armamentarium the possibility of assisted suicide? True compassion is compassion for the sufferer, not displaced compassion for the caregiver or the family. True compassion means putting a little arm around the sufferer, helping her and him in the experience of a truly good death, a death which is a human death and a dignified death. Assisted suicide is really a non-compassionate form of moral abandonment, saying to the patient, you've gotten to the point where we can't do anything. And who makes that decision? The physician. Timothy Quill, who I feel is more dangerous than Dr. Kevorkian, because Timothy Quill is seductive, he's kind, he's gentle, but he decides when the patient is ready. Dr. Kevorkian makes clear what he does, and I would rather deal with him than Mr. Quill. Death is the last act of a life, and the way we die may be our last gift to those we love. Shadowlands, that interesting movie which some of you I hope may have seen, shows how dying and suffering may be powerful, humanizing experiences. And you don't know whether it will be or not when you decide that you don't want to suffer until someone has helped you to see that dignity may be associated with suffering. This does not mean to seek out suffering. That's a non sequitur. That's an ad populum argument, bringing in something that stimulates emotion but has no reason behind it. Seventh, the slippery slope is no fairy tale. One needs only to look at the living social laboratory of euthanasia in that very rational country of Netherlands that runs an airline, which we hope is online, and I've flown on it. It's a very good airline. I like it. But the clear guidelines there have not prevented euthanasia without consent. In the Dutch government's own report of 1991, there are 1,000 cases of euthanasia without consent. And remind you, this is supposed to be voluntary. The gentleman on Dutch TV was voluntary with his wife making the decisions. 4,941 cases of excess medication without the consent of the patient, which by my count would mean 5,900 patients thereabouts killed without consent, when one of the conditions is voluntary consent. Since the report was published in the Netherlands, and I followed it closely, euthanasia has now been extended to infants, children, patients with psychiatric disorders, and patients with non-terminal illnesses, patients who are depressed adolescents. The psychological desensitization associated with administering death makes this incremental logic difficult to resist. Justice Cardozo, since this is the legal discussion, said any principle tends to expand itself to the limits of logic. Dr. Quill and Derek Humphrey both agree that 25% of the patients who are given assisted suicide by the wonderful new Oregon plan of writing a prescription for a lethal dose, 25% don't work, so be prepared for the plastic bag over the head. If terminating life is such a benefit, why should euthanasia be limited only to those who give consent? Why ask for consent? And the Dutch didn't. Even in passive euthanasia, some 20,000 patients were relieved of treatment without their consent. Clearly, infants, the senile, the comatose, the feeble, should not be denied this benefit if the logical cascade follows. If it's good, isn't it good for them? Why shouldn't we be beneficent? Eighth reason against it. Assisted suicide is not a dignified death. Sickness and suffering do not rob humans of their dignity. Humans have dignity simply because they are human. They cannot lose it because they are not absolutely in control of everything that happens to them, or because they are weak or disfigured or in pain. I've seen more dignity in persons who've suffered from chronic, intractable, disfiguring diseases than I've seen in those who have talked about dignity of other human beings lacking it themselves. The loss of dignity the dying or desperately ill patient feels is not the actual loss of his dignity as a human being. It is rather, and this is important for all of you to remember, the changed way those around him or her react to the plight. Their pity, and pity is not compassion. Pity implies distance. Compassion involves attachment. The withdrawal of those persons from the sick person. Surely it is difficult to see someone lying in their feces, someone who's in pain and disfigured and bleeding. The withdrawal, the compassion often arises out of distaste. The imputed dignity, which of course the patient senses and then does indeed feel that he or she has lost her dignity. We dignify a death by the way we confront it, no matter how wasted, weak, or wan we may be. Ninth, we're coming pretty much to the end. Assisted suicide is not a private matter. Not something, you leave me alone. No. All of us live in relationship with other human beings. Nothing so dramatic as choosing death by suicide or asking to be killed is without impact on those around us. Even when they seem to agree, and I can tell you again in dealing with these families of friends of the sufferers may not share his desires. What does suicide say to family, friends, and to other sufferers about their own confrontations with illness and death? Justice deals not only with the liberty of one person, but the protection of the whole society against the depreciation of life, the preservation of which is fundamental value in our society and very much in the state's interest. Legalization of suicide depreciates the lives of the chronically ill, the handicapped, the aged, the infants. I see it in its most pernicious form because I make rounds regularly on the pediatric intensive care unit. And here is why I see quality of life decisions made by others about human beings who have no possible chance of saying what for them would be a quality of life. What hubris, what pride, what enormous self-assurance of one's omniscience. 10th, assisting in suicide is in direct contravention of what medicine is all about. Mr. Feiger talked about the Hippocratic Oath. The oath, yes, sir, is unequivocal. It raises no question whether it was Pythagoreans or not. It has been the major influence in the history of medicine. Margaret Reed, certainly no Christian believer, pointed with significance to the fact that medicine was one of the few professions from the very beginning that was practiced within an ethical confine. The oath is unequivocal. Neither will I administrate a poison. All right. Okay, let me come to the end. Cynical though we may be about the medical profession, and I'm the first to admit our failings, there is no way to avoid trust in the medical relationship. And to enter tacitly into that relationship is to assume that you are trusting the physician, and Mr. Feiger and all the rest of you are going to have to trust at some point. Do you want to trust a physician who has in his armamentarium the capacity to end your life and offers it to you depending on his way of looking at it? I submit, therefore, that A, the law reasons for it are specious, that the benefits are illusory, and the social consequences are disastrous.